the idea of a non-religious pilgrim or a modern pilgrim or a pilgrim who uses social media or all these, let's say, modern characteristics of the pilgrim, they're quite often frowned upon by society as a whole. The research I've been doing is focusing on the modern pilgrim, and more in particular the pilgrim that walks to Santiago de Compostela or cycles to Santiago de Compostela in the northwest of Spain. There's a cathedral there that houses the remains of the apostle St. James the Elder, and every year there's more than 300,000 people who travel there. And to me this was an interesting phenomenon because it seems such an archaic, old-fashioned ritual to partake in, and so I wanted to study what brings these people there. Why do people still go there? Is that still the stereotype that we have of this ancient, medieval, Catholic ritual, or is there something new going on? And what I found, to my delight, is that indeed there is a new phenomenon taking place there. Well, the Camino, since its beginning in the 10th century, has already it grew to fame quite quickly. So within a couple hundred years, it was the third foremost pilgrimage in Europe, so after Rome and Jerusalem, of course. That is partly for theological reasons, because to actually have the remains of an apostle, that is quite a big deal, and people responded to that accordingly. When you look at the recent revival, which is indeed quite recent, it is maybe late 80s, beginning of the 90s, that numbers grew from a couple of hundred a year to 300,000 a year. So that increase is very recent and very, very steep. And that increase maybe could be linked to the kind of open character of the Camino. Because it is not necessarily characterized as a religious, Christian, Catholic pilgrimage, it opens its door to a lot more different kind of people with different backgrounds, different experiences, different expectations too, and that makes it very interesting for a lot of people to go there, because you're also going to meet a lot of different people with different backgrounds, different experiences, different expectations. What I found most interesting among this group of pilgrims, I've looked specifically at Dutch pilgrims, but you can see it on an international level, is that these pilgrims are not necessarily driven by a strictly religious narrative. So it's not necessarily people going on a pilgrimage out of devotion to St. James the Elder or even to God. Many of these pilgrims aren't even religious. There's a new set of narratives that drives them to come there. These are mostly media narratives, so Hollywood movies, best-selling novels that you pick up at an airport or a train station, magazine articles, but also increasingly online narratives. So people find a Facebook account or a blog or a YouTube channel and it interests them and this grabs them and this makes them engage with that pilgrimage and eventually actually go on that pilgrimage themselves. Then, of course, after they read these narratives or listen to these narratives or watch these narratives and they start to take an interest in it, they also start to narrate their own stories. So they might do this online or they might actually make a movie or a book, and this narrative helps them to understand themselves as pilgrims but also communicate to other potential new pilgrims, again, to go on this pilgrimage. What you see in these storytelling practices when they come online, which they are increasingly doing, of course, is again a sort of paradoxical relationship between the pilgrim and social media. On the one hand, pilgrims love to tell their stories, they really do, and social media gives them an opportunity to do that. Not only to keep a little journal for yourself or to tell your friends and family at home, but to portray your stories into the world, of course for other pilgrims or other potential pilgrims to read. And you can see that pilgrims use they write a lot of blogs, they are part of Facebook groups, they have Instagram accounts, they have YouTube channels, and they do make use of all of that. At the same time, you can already see the criticism on these kind of practices. Because people will say, well, maybe if you're a pilgrim, you're not supposed to be in contact with the home front. Maybe you're not supposed to have Twitter. Maybe you're not supposed to know what's in the news in the Netherlands. Maybe you shouldn't know whether your neighbor is redoing his lawn or whether it's your cousin's birthday. Maybe this condition of what's been called liminality is very essential for the pilgrim experience. And maybe you should hold on to that and social media take you away from that. So there are a lot of different criticism based on what people think a pilgrim experience should be and how social media and internet practices are undermining that or challenging that at least. Well, for those who use social media, of course, in their pilgrim practices, they see a lot of positive elements to this practice too. They see, for example, the potential for community building. Not only online community building in the sense that I am following this pilgrim narrative online and I feel connected to them and I want to share my own story with them and I'm going to start a conversation, but also very practically again, sometimes when you're walking the Camino, one person that you've grown very fond of and you've had a lot of lovely conversations with that are meaningful to you will walk a lot quicker than you. And by the end of the day, that person would have ended up 10 kilometers further than you and you've lost them. If you don't have something like WhatsApp or a Facebook account, you might not ever see them again. But when you do, you can say, hey, how about you take it easy tomorrow, we can meet up in that big place and we can celebrate together in Santiago, for example. So there's a lot of potential too for example, community building. The social media can also be used to extend the pilgrim experience beyond actually being physically on the Camino. Of course, it can extend it in two ways, I should say. In the beginning, it can be in your process of preparing yourself, mentally, ideologically, spiritually, it can help you in that. On the Camino it helps you, and afterwards it can help you keep those Camino feelings alive and maybe inspire you to go again next year. I must admit that before I started this research, I had actually never heard of the Camino de Santiago. I knew nothing about it. I didn't know it existed even. So I never walked the Camino before I started this. I started walking the Camino actually after I realized that my respondents here, let's say the pilgrims that I was interviewing and talking with, were not very comfortable opening up to someone who had never walked it. So whenever I would do an interview, the first question back would always be, so have you walked it yourself? And if I said no, there was like a little wall that went down and I could feel that all throughout the interview. So I figured I should go walk this, if it only that I can say yes to this question in future. So that's what I did. I walked the first time with my mom actually, and it was a wealth of stories and data for my research, but it was also very inspiring for me to do. It was such a beautiful experience that after spending that first 6 weeks on the Camino, I knew I was definitely going to come back. And I did. I've been there 4 times now to walk, 5 times. I walked 5 Caminos and I came back as a hospitalera, like a hostess at one of the pilgrim hostels. And my research is now finished and I've defended my thesis, but in 2 weeks' time I'm still flying to Santiago to walk another stretch. So I don't think it's gonna be the end for me on the Camino yet. It was a weird balance walking, especially the first time, because I sort of knew what to expect from reading all these stories and listening to all these stories before I went, but still doing it yourself is a completely different thing. So I had set up all these research methods that I was going to employ, and I had my recorder and I had my notebooks and everything at the ready to do my interviews while walking. And then I thought I would do interviews while I was walking, and then I would do interviews during the pilgrim dinner, and then I would do interviews in the bar afterwards, and I was going to write them out before I went to sleep. And one thing that I didn't take into account is how tired you are at the end of a day's walking. Because it is literally walking up at the crack of dawn, walking your stretch, finding a place to sleep, doing your laundry, because of course you're not supposed to take more than, let's say, 7-8 kilos with you, so you only have one set of clothes, so you have to wash it every day and find a place to dry. And of course, when there's no wind or there's no sunshine, it brings out all the stress. And then you need to find a place to eat, you need to find a place to sleep, all these things. Which are very hard to combine with research activities. Also, I found that pilgrims don't necessarily enjoy being recorded while they're on a spiritual journey themselves. So while I found a lot of pilgrims who wanted to talk to me and answer my questions, there was a very hesitant reaction every time I put out my recorder. So I had to rethink my whole research method as I was on the go, and to take into account that sometimes I was just too tired, or I was too grumpy, or I was too annoyed with the whole process to even do my research. At the same time that I was doing my research, I was also trying to become a pilgrim and have this experience myself. And I was there with my mother, and she was going through a hard period herself, so I wanted to be here for her. I wanted to grow myself. So there was a lot of balls in the air, a lot of things for me to engage with. I think it has changed my perspective on my research quite a lot. This is of course hard to say because I don't know what I would have done if I had not walked it or how much I would have learned. But I do think that a lot of the knowledge I have, especially a lot of the implicit knowledge that I have about the pilgrimage, comes from me experiencing it myself and considering myself a full pilgrim now too. There's that, and there's of course the different relationship I now have with other pilgrims. And I've heard a lot of appreciation from pilgrims too, who feel taken seriously and who feel a sort of empathy from an academic to take them seriously and actually walk with them to try and understand them as best as possible. Well, while I think that a lot of pilgrims react very enthusiastically to me becoming a pilgrim and walking with them and experiencing it along with them, it is sometimes a tricky balance as an academic and the way you explain yourself and your research practices to other academics. Because of course one of the first questions will always be, are you not too involved? Are you not too sympathetic? Is your judgment still clear in this? And that is a very fair question, and that is very good to keep in mind when you do this almost auto-ethnographic kind of work, that you do keep a clear eye and that you don't get so involved that you lose your critical eye. So that's always something to keep in mind in this kind of research. The first time that I walked a Camino was in 2014, and I was walking with my mom, and while we were preparing, we found out that a good friend of my mom was also going to walk. He was going to start around the same date that we were going to, but he ended up leaving just 2 days before we went. So he was walking 1 or 2 days in front of us all the time. Now the fun thing was that he also had a blog, just like my mom. And so every day, at the end of the day, he would post his blog and me and my mom would read that blog. So we would basically read about what we were going to experience the next day. And we followed in his footsteps along the way for 6 weeks. And in the end, when we arrived in Santiago, he's already left. So I had actually never encountered him on the Camino, although I felt that we'd walked the Camino together. He knew about my experiences, I knew about his experiences, I was following in his footsteps all along the way. And it was the weirdest moment when back home we actually sat down to have a glass of wine and talk about the Camino. And we could really talk about it as if we had done it together. Well, of course, our only connection was through our blogs, through our online communications. I felt like we were walking it together. I felt as much connected to him and his story as some of the people that I was physically walking with. This was actually a part of my research that I had not anticipated at all. We have talked about pilgrimage having more and more online dimensions. People telling their story online, people using GPS and different apps to navigate along the way. The most extreme version of this might be cyber pilgrimage or e-pilgrimage. It is people performing a complete pilgrimage online, so maybe without even leaving the house, maybe without even leaving their computer. I had no idea that this existed a couple of years ago, but it does, and it is quite a lot of people engage in this. I actually came across this the first time, or got a hint of this phenomena the first time, when I noticed that a lot of my family members would follow my mother's blog. So my mom, while she was walking every night, she wrote a blog about what she'd done that day. And I realized that a lot of, especially her brothers, would comment on that. And they would tell stories about every day I sit down and I pour myself a glass of wine and I read your story, and then I, go look up where you are, and they would respond to that story. So they were sort of traveling with us in a virtual manner, and that might be the very beginnings of what a cyber pilgrimage is. And when I started to look into that, I found that people also follow the blogs of people they don't know. And then there are special websites to guide people along the Camino who are not there actually. And then I found more and more elaborate websites in which people are invited to journey the whole pilgrimage virtually. This is of course not only Santiago de Compostela, there are multiple shrines that you can visit virtually. And this got me very interested in this idea of a cyber pilgrimage. Why would people do this? Is it only for people who cannot go on a pilgrimage due to illness or costs, etc.? Or are there actually elements to this cyber pilgrimage that are just very valuable and that might not even be found on a physical pilgrimage? The way I would like to develop this research at first is really to focus on these cyber pilgrims. I've become very intrigued with how we could study this. So my next step will involve trying to come up with new methodologies of studying this. Who are these people? How can we reach them? Maybe we can simulate it and see what is happening. Can we do comparisons? Also, of course, how does it work interculturally? because the open pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela is different to a Catholic pilgrimage to Rome, it's different to an Islamic Hajj to Mecca, it's different to a Hindu pilgrimage to the Ganges. This is all very different. I'd like to study how these different religions and traditions react to, let's say, an onlineification, no, to a digitalization of pilgrimage. What I would really like to know, what I still can't really put my finger on, is why we feel that religion and spirituality and meaning making is contradictory to online culture. I have the feeling that we think it is, but no one can really explain me why. There is a feeling when we hear about the Pope tweeting, or monks having social media accounts, or performing a pilgrimage online. There is a sense that it should not be possible, that it is not real, and no one can explain to me why that is. And so I'd really like to figure out what where that contradiction lies.